Hi, I'm George Howard. I'm sitting here today with Mr. Peter Lubin, who is a good friend of mine and a music industry luminary. We're going to talk about a wide range of topics, and to begin with, I'd just like Pete to introduce himself.
Right, I'm Pete Lubin, and I spent 20 years as an A&R executive at the major labels in the music industry. Now I consult to labels and publishers. I produce records, and I deal in some new technologies, secure encryption, and on-demand disc pressing, among other things.
And one of the amazing things about you, Pete, and we've known each other for getting on 10 years now or so, is that you don't stop. You know, I've seen so many people in the music business who have a certain limited field of expertise, especially in the A&R world, and it's a very closed, kind of hermetic world, and they're not able to get beyond it. And just, given your introduction there, you've done production, you've done encryption, you're doing some manufacturing elements. How do you navigate these waters? Is it the changing industry, or is it out of necessity or interest, or both? Or?
Well, basically, after leaving the major label fold, I went into the business of saying yes. Mm-hmm. The phone would ring and people would say, I've got this initiative, this business plan, this, and as much as I could, I said yes.
That's awesome.
And not necessarily for the money, but for the wide range of experience that it's brought to me,
It's somewhat of a prescient decision at this point, because those people that have walled themselves into a specific knowledge base are lacking opportunities.
Well, I would say this, let's say you spend 20 years doing A&R at the labels and suddenly you don't do A&R at the labels anymore. It's not like you can go to a mainstream industry. You can't go to the Xerox Corporation and say, well, I know how to pick hits, because they'll laugh you out of the offices. So you don't develop a skill set that's easily translatable, that's for certain.
No, I think that's an interesting point. And as the music industry evolves and changes and becomes less about the four majors and the indies or whomever that are kind of the content holders, and it being more about music slipping into all sorts of little parts of our life, the people that love music and that want to work on music have to have a wide range of abilities to work. I mean, Xerox may be a stretch, but when you've got Toyota starting labels, and music is in a whole different place than it ever was. For someone who is, you started as a publicist, right?
Well, I started as a rock journalist.
A rock journalist. Okay.
Yeah, that think Cameron Crowe in Almost Famous. Okay. When I was a little kid, me and a buddy started a rock magazine in the very beginning of what came to be rock journalism, and we had to start our own magazine because nobody would let little kids write for them. So we published it ourselves, and the thing took off a little bit and became something of an item. And so, and at the same time, because the whole rock music industry was being born, we're talking about 1970, give or take, because the whole rock industry was being born, the whole rock critic industry was being born at the same time, etc. So I ended up in a place where all kinds of people that you might have heard of, John Perellis and Robert Christgau and Richard Meltzer and Lester Bangs, they all wrote for our paper, and we wrote for all of theirs. So by the time I was 15, 16, I was in Rolling Stone magazine and Stereo Review and Crawdaddy and this and that.
So, I mean, what's interesting to me hearing you say that is how nothing's really changed. The medium has changed. Now somebody that loves music and wants access or wants to have their voice heard, they start a blog, or they start Pitchfork, or they start whatever. But to my mind, there's a character trait there of people that want to write about music, want to be filters, that is almost an essential quality for someone who wants to be in the music business.
Except there's one thing about that. The barrier to entry, for rock journalism, when I was a kid, I mean, sure, it was much higher, okay? Sure, you could aspire to it, but you couldn't publish the same day, right? Like a blogger
right,
could.
Yeah.
But there's a corollary in the music business too, because certainly back then, not everybody could record. There was a real thing about how in the days when A&R men were A&R men, they held the keys to the kingdom. Groups couldn't get inside a recording studio, primarily because they couldn't afford to get inside a recording studio, unless the A&R man opened the doors and let them in. Right. It's an interesting distinction, as opposed, of course, to today, where they can do it in their bedroom. Now, there's two arguments there. One is everybody should be entitled to record if they want to, and the other is that a well-curated culture makes for, a higher standard across the board.
Okay, so I mean, it is barriers of entry. The barriers of entry for recording have come down in the same way that the barriers of entry for starting a magazine or blog or whatever.
Right. And then what you'll hear, of course, is people saying, "Well, there aren't any filters. What the world really needs are filters," and it's true. But
do you
that's
agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
We need filters.
Well, it's only filters that are going to help people navigate the enormous amount of content that is floating around.
And this is, I guess, what I was trying. The point I was trying to make in terms of someone that has that passion to say, "I believe this record is more virtuous than another." That's a filter. And over time, if the culture, whoever that may be, gives approval to those choices, ratifies those choices over time, they become a filter. They become Chris Gow, which people unfortunately don't know who he is at this point. But
or you get to keep your gig as an A&R man.
Right, or you become Pitchfork, or you become some of these arbiters of taste. And I want to talk about A&R because I know you said one of the greatest things I've ever heard anyone say about A&R when you signed the Pixies. And I don't want to misquote you, but it went something along the lines of, you went to see this band, people were going nuts for them. You didn't understand it necessarily, but that was a very powerful thing. So I must sign them. Is that close to your?
Yeah, that's very close. Okay. But the background to that story is a little longer in the sense that, I was lucky enough to be able to do A&R for years. First of all, I got hired as a director of A&R for Mercury Records when I was 23 years old, or some such number, and that's pretty young, and that's pretty fortunate. But of course, when you're 23, you don't know anything.
Well, and I don't want to go off this tangent too much, but the path to you getting hired as an A&R person, and I don't know how viable it is for people to say, okay, I want to be an A&R person. I think we may need to change the term, but the path to you getting hired as a filter was starting this magazine, I imagine, right?
Yeah. When people ask me, well, how do you get to be an A&R man?
Right.
My stock answer, or the answer I've become most fond of, is, well, if you didn't start when you were 13, you probably don't have a great chance.
So what do you do? Because my stock answer is to people who say, I want to be an A&R person, is to start your own label. That's all.
Well, now.
Yeah, but even that's what I did. I mean, I didn't know. I don't think I knew what A&R was, but I knew.
At one point, the magazine that we were running evolved into starting our own label.
Okay.
So we did have a label, but it only lasted about a year and a half. I mean, I was down to my last $25 in the world when I finally had to give up the hope of having my independent label. Even though we had a distribution deal, at least in England, in the UK, and in Australia, New Zealand with Polygram, and they gave us advances and whatnot. But still, it was very expensive, and we didn't quite make it. So I left to go to New York, and I got hired. I mean, if we're doing my biography in a roundabout
what we're doing
way,
is, because it's a big part of the Artist House site is looking at trajectories and allowing people that are looking in on these conversations to be able to kind of plot their course and plot where am I on this timeline. And my point is kind of that, the landscape's changed a lot in the last 20, 30 years or whatever, but there's still some truisms, there's still some things to be gleaned about. How do you gain access to this industry, however you want to define it? It's not the way it was 10 years ago, and it will be different 10 years from now, but you're still going to have to try and find a way to gain access. And I think it's interesting that both you and I, at different eras, came about kind of the same way, and I think there's a takeaway there for people.
Well, but probably the common thread is ambition.
Well, I think it's ambition and a belief that your
passion.
Taste, but your taste should be heard, right? That you have a voice. I mean, that's why people start labels, right?
Yes.
I think my taste is not being served.
Right.
Right.
Or when you're a rock critic,
Or
certainly.
when you're a rock critic,
Yeah, of
I think
course.
these records deserve more attention.
Right.
And I think, especially when you talk about this idea of filters and you talk about the barriers of entry being so low, it becomes even more important. Even if you become a music supervisor, or you become someone at an ad agency, or you become someone at the music part of Starbucks, it's all the same. You need those points of view.
Well, my personal take on it is the more good taste you have, the better armed you are.
Yeah.
But good taste isn't like something you can buy at the supermarket,
Okay, but so you develop it. So back to your story. You start the magazine. It kind of morphs into a label. This leads to a gig at Electra.
No. That led to a gig. The label, there was about 5 of us, and we did everything.
Right.
We sold the records, by talking to distributors, and we promoted them at the radio stations, and we boxed them up and dragged them to the post office, and we did everything. Okay. One of the things I did was write the press releases.
Okay.
Now, we had a lot of friends in the press because we were journalists ourselves at one time. So we would write press releases, and it was the days of stiff records. Now,
Sure.
maybe nobody remembers stiff records, but there was a sort of fun-loving anarchy to stiff records that we tried to emulate. And so we would write these preposterous press releases. And
kind of the not Sub Pop anymore, but the Sub Pop at one point of today was stiff records.
That's right, exactly. And we would write these things. They would have a kernel of truth in them. Let's say we picked up Schwartz Brothers Distributing of Cleveland, Ohio, right? So we'd write some preposterous thing, and in there somewhere it would say Schwartz Brothers of Cleveland is distributing us. And the guys at the trades, which at the time was Billboard, but also Record World and Cashbox, they would get a kick out of our press releases. So because we made them laugh, they would rewrite them into actual journalism, and they would run them, right? So there was a guy in New York whose name was Howard Bloom. Howard Bloom ran the sweatshop of publicity. It was just an absolutely brutal kind of mill, and but to him, any writer was golden, and any bit of press was, a fantastic thing, and he would always read about this label in Billboard. So he called me up and he said, I'm calling to ask you, who does your press? I said, well, I do. We do everything, He says, oh, well, I need to hire somebody. This was on a Sunday night, because Howard never stopped working. It was on a Sunday night, and he called. He said, well, I need somebody. I need to add to my staff. I said, uh-huh. He said, the job starts tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And I said, well, what are you saying? Well, you have to be here in my office tomorrow. I said, Howard, I live 3 hours away. I don't have $20 left to my name. I can't be in your office at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. And he said, well, that's terrible, because the job starts at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. And I went, and I never went home.
That's $25, yeah.
I slept on my girlfriend's couch. Her dad happened to live in New York. Right. Otherwise, I'd have probably been on Lester Bang's sofa, because I slept there a few times.
Well, that's a whole different interview.
Yeah. But and then I was a publicist.